Hello everyone. I have in front of me all of my ingredients and my equipment. You can see I have liquid measuring cup, dry measuring cups, a knife for leveling, tablespoons and teaspoons. You need 3 bowls. I also have in front of me all of our ingredients. This is sugar, this is salt, and then I have flour. The recipe calls for all-purpose flour. That's what I have in here. But there's also flour that's called pizza flour. It's a 00. It's thinner, finer, it has higher levels of gluten, which changes the consistency of the dough. The recipe also calls for dry active yeast. This is traditional active dry yeast, it says. There's also yeast that's called quick rise. So if you have that, you can use it. Just follow the instructions on the jar or on the packet. The recipe calls for 1 packet or 2 1/4 teaspoons. So just like at school, we have this yeast at school in the jars, and you can measure out 2 1/4 teaspoons. But if you bought the packets, you can use 1 packet. The next part of the recipe, I said I have salt over here. The recipe actually calls for kosher salt. Kosher salt is a coarser salt, and you can use this. You don't have to. You could use regular salt, but it's always good to try and follow what the recipe suggests. So I'll be using this. And then the last ingredient was the olive oil. The first step is to spray out a large bowl with cooking oil or cooking spray. And I don't use cooking spray, I said, so I'm gonna use a paper towel. I'm gonna put a little bit of olive oil on the paper towel, like this, which is more than a little. And then I'm gonna rub the oil on my inside of my bowl like that. Set that aside for later. Start with a small bowl. Stir together lukewarm water, which is already measured out, 1 1/4 cups, 1 tablespoon of granulated sugar, and we're gonna mix those together. We're gonna stir those together, and then we're gonna sprinkle the 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast over the water, and we're gonna let that sit for 8 minutes. Okay, now the recipe calls for you to use another large bowl, so not the one that you put grease in, and add 3 cups of flour. I'm using the all-purpose flour. 2 teaspoons of kosher salt, which you can see it's coarser. I think you can see, maybe. There you go. And a 1/4 cup of extra virgin olive oil. The yeast has sat for 8 minutes and it should be frothy. Mine looks more cloudy than frothy. Frothy usually means there's like bubbles along the edges or bubbles on the top or the surface. This is still worth using. If I stir it up, you can see that it's pretty cloudy. So we're gonna give this a try. So we're gonna pour this yeast mixture in with the flour and the oil and the salt. The way it's described, it says to mix with a wooden spoon. I really like this curved rubber spatula I have, so I'm gonna use it. I like it because it scrapes off the edges. So I would go around the outside of the bowl, mix back into the middle like that. And it says to stir until everything is combined and a shaggy dough starts to form. Shaggy dough means these little bits like this have come together. It kind of looks stringy or clumpy. So it doesn't need to be perfect. It's not supposed to be smooth. It's just supposed to be ingredients combined. You can see I have flour on the bottom that's separate. You don't want to overwork the dough. We've talked about that before. You just want to get it combined. The next step says to knead the dough against the sides of the bowl until the dough starts to come together. So what that looks like is taking it over, folding it, using the heel of your hand. You fold, and then use the heel of your hand to push down. Fold, push down, turn it, fold it, push it down, turn it, fold it, push it down, You can see as I do this, it's picking up the flour off the bowl, which you don't need it to. Like you can go without that bit of flour. You can also see that the dough is becoming smoother, less shaggy, as they would call it. And it's starting to look more, this is called elastic, when you can kind of pull it and it stretches. It's formed a dough. So again, we're gonna move on to the next step. Says to put your dough out on a lightly floured surface. I've taken a little bit of flour. I've spread it like this with the palm of my hand. I actually washed my hands again, and then I've left almost like a little, it's not a pile because there's hardly anything there, but a little bit extra flour so I can always add a little bit more. This step I think is really important. I feel like a lot of times people put too much flour on the counter. Just know that when you do that, you're drying out your dough. You're adding more flour into the recipe than it was intended. You just want enough so that it doesn't stick to the surface, and it just leaves this sort of texture on the countertop that's a little bit gritty and keeps the keeps the dough from sticking. So we're going to turn the dough out onto this floured surface, sprinkle a little more flour on top, again so it doesn't stick. You can also take flour and rub it between your hands so that your hands don't stick. And we're going to knead the dough until it feels elastic, and I'll show you an indicator of that, and only slightly tacky, which means it isn't going to stick to you or to the counter. Knead away again. So I push with the heel of my hand, fold, turn, fold, heel of my hand, and roll away from myself. Turn, fold, heel of my hand, and knead away from myself. I'm gonna add a little more flour back. And you're gonna continue this for 5 minutes. Okay, I'm just finishing up my 5 minutes. My dough has gotten a lot smoother on the outside. I've continued to add a little bit of flour so it doesn't stick while I knead and form my dough. The next thing you can do is kind of form it into a ball, and you do that by kind of scrunching it together and shaping it with your hands. You can kind of tuck it under as you turn it. And then to test the dough, you can put your finger in it and poke a hole, and you should see the hole pop back up. I don't know if you can see that. It won't necessarily come all the way. The longer you knead it, the quicker it pops back up. And you can see it rise again. And you can see the old holes I did are pretty much gone. Anyway, that's how you know it's done. It says to check, it should still feel elasticy. Elastic means it'll have that stretch to it. And a little bit tacky, which you'll notice more inside the dough than on the surface. This feels like a bit of a firm cloud. Place it into your oiled bowl like this. And you're going to cover it with a tea towel. And you're gonna put it in a warm place to let it rise. It'll double in size, and you're gonna leave it there for about an hour and a half. Sometimes, if I feel like it's gonna be longer than an hour and a half, like today I'm going into the school for a little bit, so it might be longer than an hour and a half, you can put a little bit of oil on top of the dough, and that just stops it from forming a crust. The other way to do that is to flip it around in your oiled bowl. If you leave it for too long, it'll get kind of like a crust, which isn't a big deal because you can just tear it off, but this helps prevent that. So we're just gonna cover that. And a warm place in your kitchen could be somewhere where the sun shines in, or it could be on top of your stove if you're cooking other things on the stove. I'm just gonna set mine on top of the stove, and room temperature really is okay. You'll still see your dough rise. All right, I'm back. I've been gone a lot longer than an hour and a half, and it's not a bad thing actually to show you guys. It was puffed up. You can kind of see how it's flattened. And I did get that layer on top, and you can pick it off if you want. It's not the end of the world if it's in there. But if yours isn't like mine and it's puffed up, you punch it down with your fist to get the air out, which I think is the best part. Anyway, you'll see, you can see kind of where the bubbles have formed in the dough. Flip it over, punch it down, and now this is your new dough. We're gonna take the dough, and the goal is to divide it in half. I'm gonna just do that on the counter. Do that by putting a bit of flour. That's a lot of flour. On the counter like this. And then it says to divide in half. You're just gonna break it down the middle. You can do this with a knife too. And now you have two pieces for your calzones. So leave these again for another 20 minutes